Welcome. In today's video, what I wanted to do was show you the maybe alternate side of a reality that we're being spouted at is false, and that it is actually true, and it's true in the ways I think that maybe you don't expect, but when I hopefully explain and explicate, you'll understand what I mean. So there's been a current or an undercurrent of modern discourse and you could say research and academic institutional building towards this idea that there's a huge overarching patriarchal issue called whiteness and institutional whiteness and discrimination, and that we are oppressing, or if you are on the alternate side here, you're being oppressed institutionally, systematically, as in there are fundamental realities that are constructed oppressing you and your ability to thrive. And I think there's a pure admittance on the incumbent side, or the you could call it the white European side, where we say, no, of course not. We make a as unbiased institution as possible. It ignores all these factors in the name of egalitarianism, particularly in front of the law. And this goes back to Rousseau, that all men are equal under the law, and that we have a disposition legally to make sure that you're treated fairly. However, and this is where I actually start to veer into the territory of postmodernists, in that I think the structural integrity of something built to cater towards a specific culture is inherently biased for that culture's beliefs and actions. And I think that's evidenced and borne out particularly by the interactions and actions of immigrants from different cultures who move to the West. They do not fundamentally fit in. They cannot transmit their own ideas and ideologies in a way that's undisturbed. They always come with something so glaringly out of place that it's noticed, that it's warranted attention to. This is something as simple as their food, but it's also how they dress and how they talk, and then also comes down to other outcomes governmentally or like civilly, which includes things like crime and educational discrepancies and disparities, as well as anything from the notion of what a nuclear family looks like, what marriages are acceptable or not acceptable. And so what I want to do here is explain why I think that they're actually correct, why all these academics and these progressives and these very liberal-leaning academic institutions actually have something to say here, and I definitely don't think to the extent that they've said it a billion times is necessary. I think once is enough, but nevertheless, they have, I would say, the right to build this. And I think, ironically, obviously, the entire idea of postmodernism or the post-structuralism was actually engineered or designed by white people against themselves, which I think is maybe the peak of irony here. Nevertheless, it did, for me, have a certain piquancy around why do they believe this thing. And after looking at it, I actually tended to agree. It says, the system as constructed is not conducive to a beneficial and productive lifestyle for those who aren't part of the ruling class and or within this realm of acceptable and unacceptable. But that makes sense, right? If you look at Smurftown as its homogenous unicultural society, they have small issues, but in general, they live quite seemingly productive lives with harmony. And they have all these halcyon days where everyone gets together and enjoys each other's company. There's a high trust society. They're building it towards something. So you can understand why this monoculture actually is an effective both coercion tool towards maintaining civil liberties. Everyone here has sovereignty to a certain degree. Papa Smurf, I think, being the patriarch of the Smurf village, helps a lot in terms of guidance, and people look up to him in a good-natured way. And there's something to be said of the diversity of Smurftown, that it's a one of thought, which is the only diversity anyone should care about. Now, this, I think, is hopefully the flippant side of this aside, is a good illustration as to what I mean, is when you design a society around thousands of years of existence, you can't just turn a switch on where you introduce a bunch of people who fundamentally and genetically are not predisposed to acting in certain ways. You have a complete and utter destruction of the capabilities of a system when it's trying to cater towards things it was never designed to have to deal with. And this, I think, was known by our ancestors. We have, well, our mythology is designed around, I think it's probably, at least from my understanding, one where we have gone through these things before. And that's what Ragnarok tells us is true. So this hermeneutics, this understanding of the reality we have from our own legends, and that we do have Heimdall. And Heimdall here is, if you don't know, the guardian of Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, which protects our world and Asgard and the Nine Realms against the forces of, you call it evil, but we can call it chaos, I think is maybe a better term. And they, once Ragnarok ensues, march upon Asgard, led by Loki. And Heimdall here, with his Gjallarhorn, which is the horn that sounds the invasion, he's known as his head is the sword and is the whitest of gods, the glittering hero, where he eventually is slain and slays simultaneously Loki during the denouement of Ragnarok. And so in that, I think we can learn an important lesson about how we fundamentally understand this from a conceptual, but also, as I said, hermeneutically standpoint, where we can tie in what is known to us on a blood level, something that will happen, which is that we have this instinct, this knightly courage towards dying at the death of our own society, and it will come from in the way of monsters and giants led by what is probably a turncoat. And a turncoat, if you don't know, is what happens in the army, or it did, where if you were trying to perfidiously abandon your post and turn into the enemy, you would turn your coat inside out and it would be a different color, thereby not identifying you with the army that you'd obviously been employed by. I think this is also a good point to jump into why I think we can err on the side of post-structuralism and postmodernism as being a true representation of our reality in a way that we can actually embrace to a degree. I think I wouldn't go so far as saying subjectivism is true, because when you start looking at post-modernist philosophers, particularly a lot of the French ones like Derrida and Lacan and Baudrillard, you have this idea that there's first of all, there's a Marxist metaphysics that's pervasive, which is obviously nonsensical, but you have this idea that subjectivism can be true, that everything can be subject and not necessarily have to be held within bounds or structured in a way that's hierarchical and objective. But I think that's obviously also not true. I think it's a very dishonorable way to go about understanding reality, and that it's almost done performatively. So it was said and it was avid by these French philosophers because it's objectionable. They do it to try to defy reality or be illogical for it being illogical's sake, rather than trying to define what is a coherent philosophy around something. It's easier to just be offensive and thereby renowned and thereby establish your own legacy. No, I don't think necessarily there's nothing worthwhile reading in French philosophy. I got a lot out of understanding what hyperreality and consumerism was from at least Baudrillard, and the power decanism from Derrida. But I think it's also nice to be skeptical when you read philosophy like this, even if you can take some kernels of truth away. In general, I think there's not much to be said in the way of understanding weak men and their interpretations of reality, because they will always come from the perspective of their own failings, of their own weaknesses. And that's obviously just a recipe for misunderstanding what it means to be a Teutonic Faustian man, where we are, and woman, we are seeking and focusing on bettering and becoming. And maybe Heidegger does a better job at promoting this base level of understanding, a more neutral level of being in time, but the idea that time is the essence of our actual starting point here, where we're saying you can build off of that. You can become existential and promote certain philosophies to deal with your existentialism in that way. You can banish nihilism, because nihilism is only the treatment of a life without the pressure of time and of being. Nihilism is the absence of all of these things, and it's fundamentally irreconcilable with life. But I think what it's good to say then is that if you are then buying into this argument, is to say, yes, we actually do have a white society. It's built on these principles. And I can see here, just going to Google Scholar and having a look at the difference, which is about 100,000x, so a fair few magnitudes difference in terms of what we think academically around the idea that we are, our institutions are white. Now, there's been a misattribution, but I would say probably a deliberate malignment to whiteness as an institutional force, where it's assumed to be an evil thing because the people who are writing the papers are in a position of no power. They are oppressed by the fact they're inadequate. They're inadequate because they cannot conceptualize having to actually fight and win in the system that's constructed. So there's been 1,000 years, say almost 2,000 years of Germanic and Teutonic system building. So we have a social contract that's understood implicitly and tacitly. And when you spawn into it, it becomes of you the naturalized system that you have to abide by, whether that's through birth or immigration, then your understanding of it is always one of, how do I raise my own stakes? How do I become higher on this hierarchy that's established? It's pre-established for me. Now, this is where you get this idea of whiteness as beauty that the brown hordes complain about. Is to say, like, why do third worlders want to whiten their skin? Why do they want to have sharper features? Why is it that they want straight hair? Why is it blonde is more attractive than brown? Why are blue eyes more attractive than brown? This type of idea is the fundamental reality of the world, that we've established a singular view and viewpoint of what good looks like. We have the idea so entrenched in everyone's minds because it's true. We, as the last culture, the Faustian culture, have established our right to be the rulers in this way, that everyone tries to gravitate upwards to it, or, if impossible, tear it down. But you're still operating with the understanding that it is the system that you live in. So there's this, once again, tacit understanding that you're competing and you're being part of this system. For me, then, it's a good establishment of very basic principles that have been universal since time immemorial, which is the strong versus the weak. A weak man or a weak woman will always seek to undermine the strong in a way that allows them to be elevated in their own level. This is very basic, and a lot of people already know this sort of stuff. But it is also, I think, illustrative as to why there's a defensive mechanism associated with identifying these power structures. Because one thing is to say, I identify something. So if Darwin goes and identifies a whole bunch of finches' heads being different shaped for different purposes, that can be near enough as to be objective. It's to say that it's just an observation of the reality. So you can observe a reality and not have commentary, which is necessarily opining certain viewpoints and politicizing it. But naturally, because of their own self-psychic infliction upon them by the idea that they're actually inferior, they become themselves the agents of hate, and then you necessarily get all this despicable behavior towards undermining and trying to retrench what is the established view and the established hierarchy. But because it's so intuitive, we already know that fat is not beautiful. We know that ugly is not beautiful. We know that weakness is not strength. You can't fundamentally change the intuition of the Faustian man. He is born, and she is born, with this reality embedded into their perspective. The kid who is 3 knows these things, regardless as if you're trying to indoctrinate them with certain dogma. And this, I think, is probably one of those feeding forces, or it goes into galvanizing the opposite side, that is the defensive, conservative, neo-reactionary side of, no, we're not institutional, we're unbiased. But I think you can accept that reality. You say, yeah, we are biased, everyone's biased, but our bias is built and enforced by generations of success. We have come to the understanding that we are the rulers of this planet, effectively in a soft and hard power way, because of the way that we've run institutions and because of our Faustian desire for the infinite. This pull, this Teutonic society's establishment of good versus evil is not necessarily objective. It is subjective. But it's now the objective in the sense that you've built the society around the pillar here, and you can't transplant it. It cannot be done away with as a mirage. It exists fundamentally now that you have to position yourself opposite to it, which is why I think hyper-reality as an understanding only goes so far. You can only derive and you can only reduce characteristics down to a certain symbolic level without also just admitting that there is a underlying bedrock of reality that you have to deal with. And so this is where you get the remnants of Faustian, of the Teutonic culture. You have a gravitation towards these men with souls. So zombies in popular fiction will always gravitate to the living, right? This is the idea that there's a pull. The pull here is exactly the same. The reason Trump is so magnetic is because he's a Faustian man and he retains his Faustian soul. And now his spirit is obviously very enlarged by his own pursuits, and so it feeds into his idea of himself, and you get this enlargement of his ego in that way. But I don't think that's a negative. I think if you are true to yourself in that way, you are a Viking or you are a knight, and you feed that spirit with success, then you will become that level of person. And for him, I think that's what makes people gravitate towards him, is that they can understand and recognize in him that greatness that they also think that they could possess if they were committed in that degree to that thing. But it's also why you have a large rejection of him by non-Faustian peoples. You look at the colored races and they are disdainful of him in ways that feels almost racist. And I don't say that as a negative. I think that that's probably the natural reaction you would have towards someone who's threatening what is your tribe in that way. You say, look, he's coming to me with ideas that smack of colonialism almost. And when people laugh at the academics saying, oh, you're colonizing certain structures here, I actually think that that's true. I think that in general, white society does colonize every aspect of all other societies because it's the best version of these things. You live towards greatness in the way that if you attach yourself to it, it elevates you in society and structure in the global perspective. So why wouldn't you? And then the idea of an empirical scientific system or anything about peer review or all of these systems are in their base just the Faustian expression of make me a believer, convince me to join your side. And so they're even in the rejection of white society, using white society and its instruments. And the irony is obviously lost on them to that degree. It's if you already use the instruments because they're effective and you know what they should be helping you do, why not just join the team that's already winning? Why not just provide more momentum? You know, if we're all actually working together, if you can channel that energy in towards more productive and concentrated and allied forces. And I know there's a natural instinct here to clash, and this is why we have a Viking and a knightly spirit inside of us warring at all times. And they're expressed externally in individuals grouping and collaborating. But I think the idea then should be you can understand their temperament and their disdain for general society by the way of a thrall against the other classes. So if you're a herdman and you're owning your own land and being part of the system whereby the Jarl will call on you and your duty to serve, and you're given benefits just by the sheer existence of who you are and your class, then the thralls underneath you are obviously going to be unhappy unless they're treated in certain ways that make them somewhat special in their own hierarchy. And obviously that's not the case here. It's agnostic. No one's giving you special treatment upon birth unless your parents are enabling you a large degree of freedom in that way. I think last point I wanted to make here is around subversion, and that I think it does serve a purpose. I think being subversive can be a purposeful activity, but it is always generally negative, just like a critic is. So I don't think, and you can see here some horrible artwork that is fairly celebrated in postmodern, not this in particular, I don't know what this is, but in particular and in general, both of these occurrences of art as an expression of a subversion of an expectation is really just a way of admitting that I'm not good enough to actually compete on the grounds of greatness. No one goes in and says, I'm going to compete against Bach in writing a fugue, because you can't do it. You're not capable. So what you do is you make pop music, which is much more I'd say at least commercialized in a way that it's fundamentally easier. And the feedback mechanism can be, well, it's not for everybody. There's different types and different suits of tastes, and therefore I'm still expressing my own energies in a way that's satisfying to some people. Much easier on the ego and your own expectations to admit that you're still successful in a different dimension. You've changed what game you're playing, so you're not a loser. But does greatness have to, like someone who is great, or if you want to compete in actual heroism and become a warrior, I mean, a warrior is always determined on a battlefield. You can't change that. It's a fundamental place where the reality is not a hyper reality. It's the grounded physical being. You have to become the man or the woman you are in the one environment. And this is why game theory and combinatorics and all of these mathematical principles exist much more seamlessly and without debate, is because when you have what is much more concrete, quantitative versions of a reality, you can't start to colonize it. It just is. Now, it already is because of the way the Faustian man has designed it, but there's less interest in trying to defy it because it's harder to grasp initially, but it's also harder to subvert, because truth is demonstrable. You can only have certain axioms and proofs and logic deployed in a way that actually allows you to understand it. Because when you think about language games and the way that we understand information, because it can be quite difficult and subjective in some ways, then in that way it's much easier to deal with the reality of language than it is with mathematics in this case, or say something like music, or even something like art with painting. No one's trying to be Rembrandt because obviously he's unsurpassable. Thereby I'll just do crazy squiggles on a picture and say it's subversive. It's just cope. It's a very deep coping mechanism, I think, by the admittance that you can't be as great as your talent or your ego want you to be. This aligns itself quite heavily with what they call the incredulity of meta-narratives. But there is a meta-narrative. It is the Faustian narrative. This is why the post-structuralist French philosophy got it all so wrong. It's because they tried to subvert and they tried to position and pivot too far away from an actual metaphysical reality. You have to just accept that you're in a Faustian world now, and that you're doomed or blessed in a way that if you understand the hierarchical structures, then you can perform activities which guide you into success. It's not that difficult once you just accept it. I think you just have to embrace the fact that this is where you are, who you are as an agent in this realm, and that you can either whine and be all callow and combative against it, and you struggle against a system that's not going to mechanistically change, or you accept it and you're trying to deal with this reality. I think this is why you find some type of immigrants from certain types of places integrate better in a structural way, if not a social way, because obviously if you are brown or Asian or some different type of features, you'll always consider yourself different in that way, and that's just intuitive in the mechanism that humans use to infer things. But in general, in the structural way, if I took you as like an economist would as a number in a system, and I saw your demographic profile, then I could say there's an integrated person, no crime rates, low strain on the system, beneficial from a taxpayer perspective, etc., etc. That's why you have this integration, is because some people are accepting of the game. They go, okay, this is how it's structured. I'll play it, and I'll do my best. And you can still win. There's a way to transcend a hierarchy. You can always find a way. It's possible. You just need to actually have the will and the want. I think then, lastly, I'll just leave you with what is two stanzas from Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, which I think illustrates this point to a T. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wild, your new court, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit, and work another's gain. And obviously you should read the rest of this delightful poem, but in general, I think you can hopefully come to a certain level of approbation that we as a society are actually colonizing everyone else's ideas and institutions. But that is not necessarily a bad thing.